tonight's lesson, how emotional and situational wisdom shape rabbinic responsa. Okay. Well, when is the first time that, not the first time maybe, but definitely not the first time, but what is maybe one of the most famous moments in Jewish history that you probably know of, probably, not definitely, but you probably know of, where a sage, we'll say, used wisdom to determine a rabbinic response to a situation? Possibly the most famous is a story that happened with a man by the name of King Solomon. You ever hear of King Solomon? So King Solomon, when he was a young king, he was actually young, very young, but when he became king, God came to him in a dream. We have this from the book of Samuel. This is a documented story in the Torah, in our prophets. So as God says to Solomon, ask for anything and I will give it to you. Okay. So he's a young king. He can ask for control over his enemies, wealth, power. There are a lot of things to ask for, right? What does King Solomon ask for? An understanding heart to judge your people. That's what he asked God for. And that's how he became the wisest of all men, because God gave him wisdom, a discerning heart. Okay, and that's what we're talking about today. So what happens is after he wakes up with his blessing, he goes to he didn't build the temple yet because he was the one who built the first temple. He didn't build the temple yet. He's still a young king. He goes to where the ark, known as the Aron, was, and that was, the representation of the temple at that time, which was in a temporary place in Jerusalem, and he thanks God. And immediately afterwards, his first test of judging comes across. What's the story? Anyone know the story? The two babies, right? So there are two women. They're sharing the same house, maybe the same room even. They both have infants, newborns, and one of the mothers, suffocates her baby over at night without realizing. We'll assume, and the two mothers come to the king, and King Solomon, and one mother says, "The living baby that she is holding is mine. I woke up in the morning, I see that I have a dead baby next to me, and it's not my baby." So she suffocated her baby, and she switched it with mine. The other mother says, "The dead baby is hers." That's an indicator, by the way, right there. The dead baby is hers, and the live baby is mine. If you pay close attention to the way I just said it, you'll understand that that's an indicator, but we're not going to discuss that tonight. That itself is an indicator. So, so what do? So King Solomon firstly does imagotherapy. Who knows what imagotherapy is? Nobody. Hey, don't tell me what your relationships look like. No, so imagotherapy is this method that when your spouse or someone you're in a close relationship with speaks to you, you always repeat back to them what they said, so you confirm that you heard them correctly, and then you respond. It's actually a very good technique. But anyway, King Solomon does that. Why does he do that? He wants them to be clear, because he wants to be. He's a man with an understanding heart. He wants them to be clear that he understands everything that they just said. He understands what's going on. And then he makes his famous proclamation, "Bring me a sword. We're going to chop the baby in half." Right? And one mother says, "No, let her keep the baby." And the other one says, that's a fair solution. Right? So King Solomon says, "Okay, now we know who the mother is." Right? Brilliant. So what is he doing here? He's actually using emotional and situational wisdom to actually figure out what's going on over here. He used his intuition, right? His EQ. He used his EQ in order to figure out what's going on over here. So this is what we're going to be discussing tonight. Like until now, we discussed, like in lesson number 2, we discussed how rabbis spend time investigating the facts. Why is the Nile rising, right? Okay, so we have to investigate that, right? We discussed applying texts, how you apply certain texts of the Torah and the Talmud to certain situations. We discussed counterweights where you have, right, conflicting values. But tonight we're discussing insight of humanity, understanding human beings. And this actually may be the most difficult part of being a rabbi, because it's hard to teach people how to be intuitive, right? How to have an EQ, how to understand people, right? Some people have it better than others. And the better you have it, the better of a rabbi one is going to be. And you can clearly see that amongst rabbis. You can see that certain rabbis, I'm talking about when you're looking for a halachic ruling, you can see that some understand maybe a little bit better. I hope they all understand, but some maybe understand a little bit better. And that can make a very, very big difference. Let's look at text number 1 as a start, which is on page 191. If you don't mind, Nathan, you have that microphone there. Yeah.
I remember the off-script conversations we had with my teacher, the great Rabbi Moshe Sofer, of blessed memory. He would tell us, "Take heed, my children. Mastering the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, is a great achievement, but it's within reach. The challenge lies in the 5th section of the Shulchan Aruch, knowing how to guide a generation and a community according to its unique needs, knowing when to act and knowing when to hold back, when to be lenient and when to be strict. This requires extraordinary help from heaven."
Okay. So everyone in yeshiva knows this. There's something that we say that there are 4 halakim. There are 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law. If you want to see what they are, you can look on the screen, or you can look on figure 5.1. These are the 4 sections of the Code of Jewish Law. There's Orach Chaim. Okay. There is Yoredeya, Zevin Ezra, Choshen Mishpat. They each deal with different things, different areas of Jewish law, right? And we all know that there's the finifte chelek. It's in Yiddish. Finifte means the finif. There's the 5th section, and the 5th section is common sense, is insight, is understanding. And without that, a lot of times it becomes difficult to apply everything you learn. And we're going to understand how this works in a number of different ways. But what we're talking about is the 5th factor. That is wisdom, insight into human nature, and that's acquired through our rabbinic apprenticeship. So how can you develop this? The way to develop this is through something which I think I mentioned in the previous class. It's called shimush. Shimush is apprenticeship, which means, and this is required for anyone who's going to be a rabbi, who's going to be making halachic decisions. You sit in the office of a seasoned rabbi for maybe a few years, and you listen to him answering questions. You hear the question, you hear the answer. You hear the question, you hear the answer. And you begin to develop, and sometimes you're like shocked by the answer. You ask him, why did you answer that? And he explains, oh, this person, you have to understand that this person has this in this circumstance, and therefore, whatever it may be. And you begin to learn nuances, and you develop nuances, and that's how you actually develop this 5th factor, which is what our class is going to be about. And this is the most difficult to develop, but it can be developed through sitting with someone who has a high level, a rabbi who has a high level of wisdom. So what we're going to be discussing tonight is case number 1, seeing the questioner, not the question. A lot of times, this is a major insight in general in life, and that is a lot of times we hear the facts. Like, sometimes people will send me an email and they'll write something emotional. When I say emotional, I mean it's a heartfelt thing. Like, Rabbi, I really enjoyed the class last night. I have a question for you. And they ask me some random question. And my nature, I catch myself sometimes, I'm realizing that I start responding to the question. And I completely, ignored a statement that they made before the question, right? And that's when we lose sight of the questioner and we are only focusing on the question, which is very easy to do. But when we maintain focus on the questioner, who's asking this question, it gives us context to the question. And we don't only answer the question, we answer the questioner, which is more important than answering the question. Far more important than answering the question. And you'll understand how this works in a minute. So case 2 and 3, we're going to be talking about how time and place also gives insight to a situation. And through that, let me just see if I can. Just a second. Sorry, everyone. Okay. Just so to prevent any feedback. Okay. So we're going to time and place. So time and place is consideration and gives insight to a question. Then we have motives, people's motives, understanding how people think, what motivates people, what drives people to do things. We're going to see a really interesting scenario where motives are, or what leading, is what's making people super religious in a very specific scenario, right? Which is always suspicious. Why are you getting so religious over there, right? And then case number 5 is promoting greater good within the community. Okay, how there is the EQ of understanding that when we operate a certain way, we develop, we can enhance the community. All right, so let's start with the answer to answer the person, the questioner, not just the question. Let's go there, and I'm going to start with a story that is a very well-known story where a Jew came to a great halachic Jewish law authority by the name of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. He was the probably the great-grandfather of Rabbi Soloveitchik. Some of you may know of, who was the dean of Yeshiva University, the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Yeshiva University until the 1980s when he passed away. And this is his great-grandfather in Europe. And someone once came to him, knocked on his door. Rabbi, I have a question. At the Passover Seder, is one allowed to use milk instead of wine? That was his question. Okay. What's the answer? Okay. The answer is no. Anyone have anything else to say about it? Nachman knows the story. If we answer the question, the answer is no. But if we answer the questioner, not only the answer no, but the rabbi may say, you don't have money for wine. Let me give you $50 and you'll be able to buy a case of wine or whatever. Not for $50, but you'll be able to buy a few bottles of wine, right? $50, you'll have wine for the Seder, right? That's if you hear the question. But the questioner, but if you listen not to the question, but to the questioner, you understand something else. If he's drinking milk by the Seder, what's he eating by the Seder? Not meat and not pizza. There's not meat. And by a holiday meal, you're supposed to eat meat. So he goes and grabs a big chunk of money and he says, here's some help for your Seder. His wife looks at him and says, what are you doing? Why are you giving him so much money? He said, because if he's asking if he can drink milk, that means he doesn't have meat as well. That is seeing the broader picture, seeing the broader person, not just getting caught up in the minutia of the question. Okay? So, and that's a very, very powerful skill. That's very powerful not only for a rabbi, it's powerful for anybody, by the way. Yeah. Yeah. Again, you use grape juice. Yeah. Use grape juice. You can use grape juice. Yeah. Yeah. But I don't think they had AA back in 150 years ago. I think everyone was a drunk. The whole Russia was drunk. If you weren't drunk, you had to go to the meetings. Anyway, okay. So here's the fascinating. That was just by way of introduction, actually. Don't answer the question, answer the questioner. Here we have a question that came up in Manchester, England, 1963. All right. Some of you know of 1963. I missed it by a few years. But 1963, Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss, who would become a world-renowned halachic authority, at that time was a halachic authority. He wasn't as world-renowned yet, but he's a very prominent rabbi. And he gets a question, which is in text 2a. Very interesting question.
A patient with a contagious disease is hospitalized in a facility where all items patients bring in are incinerated, is it permitted to bring tefillin there to fulfill the mitzvah? I have already written in Shililot Yudishvot Minchat Yitzhak 3:3 that I'm inclined to say one should not bring tefillin so as not to risk the severe desecration involved in their burning. See there. As to what you wrote, that it isn't certain that they will be burned, for perhaps researchers will discover a new cure and the illness will no longer be contagious and the incineration protocol will be lifted. Certainly, this is an unlikely possibility. Even though in recent times science has discovered many new treatments, it is well known that when it comes to caution around the contagious diseases, the medical field is more stringent today than in previous generations. Consequently, the likelihood that the incineration protocol will be lifted is remote.
Okay, so the question is, can you bring a pair of tefillin into a patient where everything in that area, because it's a contagious disease, is going to be incinerated? That means you know that tefillin are going to be burned, right? Which is a terrible thing you can't do. It has God's name in the parchments that are in the tefillin, right? So the argument that one rabbi tried to make in defense of the patient is that we don't know for sure it's going to be incinerated. Maybe they'll discover this is not an infectious disease, and then they won't burn it. So he says that's very unlikely. That's too unrealistic. And therefore, I would think you would have to burn it, right? And he says that he already wrote a responsa about this. However, now he says, I have reconsidered this. This is, by the way, the humility of a rabbi. This is a good rabbi. This is a sign of a good rabbi, that he's willing to reconsider. Why is he reconsidering? He's reconsidering because he was informed of some other information from another rabbi. Okay, what was his other information? It was from another rabbi who lives in Manchester, whose name was Rabbi Yehuda Zev Segel, who shared some information with him. And that is a situation that he dealt with. Let's read text 2b.
However, I was prompted to reconsider by a distinguished Torah scholar who argued that withholding the tefillin could cause significant distress to a God-fearing patient, deeply pained by his inability to fulfill the mitzvah. Such emotional anguish might even compromise the patient's physical health. In light of this, there is room to be lenient and permit bringing tefillin to the hospital. This scholar showed me that the great and righteous LUBAVITCH Rebbe, may he be well, wrote to him this line of thinking regarding a patient for whom there was a question of whether he was permitted to pray and study Torah. Therefore, in our case, if the patient asks for the tefillin, and we know that he will suffer greatly if he cannot fulfill the mitzvah, and there is concern that this distress may cause mental deterioration, we should rule leniently. After all, there is no definitive ruling in this case, and my prior ruling was only that, due to the doubt, it is preferable to remain passive. Therefore, under the aforementioned circumstances, we should allow him to bring tefillin so that he may fulfill the mitzvah and be at ease.
Okay, so there are a few very interesting things about this. Number one, you see, when you're asked a question about tefillin being burned, what do you think about? Whether tefillin being burned. When you're thinking about the person involved, now you're thinking about a whole different situation. If you take someone who is religious or not religious, you take a Jew who puts on tefillin every day. By the way, we have a Tefillin Jews, is called, a WhatsApp group of a whole bunch of guys. We have probably 15 guys now. It continues to grow, who put on tefillin every day, and they take a selfie and they post it. And this way, everyone's supporting each other, and the group is growing. And I don't think any of these guys, maybe one or two of them, are religious. Whatever religious is, right? But like formally, whatever. They put on tefillin. You're a Jew, you put on tefillin, right? So he puts on tefillin. Now, if a guy puts on tefillin every single day and suddenly you take that away from him, that can create a lot of emotional distress, especially when the person's sick and they want to pray and they know this is the best way to pray, right? So when you start focusing on the bigger picture, then you look at the story very differently, and that's exactly what the Rebbe told to this Rabbi Yehuda Zev Segel, whose scenario we're going to get to in a minute. Okay, so Mr. Rabbi Yitzchak Weiss said, "Oh, that's a good argument. I didn't think of that. And for that reason, I will permit now that he can put on tefillin, because the life of a person is the most important thing, right? Because life and death, we override almost every mitzvah in the Torah to preserve life. So the fifth factor is this sensitivity. The sensitivity towards understanding the nuance of a person. I want to add one other thing also, and that is that I think part of the reason possibly why the Rebbe is the one who brought this up is because the Rebbe had unbelievable faith in the faith of a Jew. And so much so, like some people say, what? Okay, so he can't put on tefillin. He knows he's sick and this and that, so it doesn't bother him. No. A Jew's soul, it gets affected the moment they can't, and that absolutely will create distress to the person. So what was the story where the Rebbe said this? So the story was that there was a Hasidic Jew, a Chabad or LUBAVITCH Jew, who was fitted with a catheter, a urinary catheter. Okay. And now he constantly has urine right next to him. You're not allowed to pray or say any holy words or even study Torah when there's any waste. So he asked Rabbi Yehuda Zev Segel whether he's allowed to pray. He's allowed to daven, and we daven 3 times a day. And he's a Hasidic Jew. So Rabbi Yehuda Zev Segel said, I don't think so. Because you constantly have waste next to you. Right? So you can't pray. It's a famous story about the 2 great Hasidic masters, Reb Zusha, Reb Melech and Reb Zusha. Have you ever heard the story? It's a cute story they always tell. I'm going to say very, very, very briefly. But basically, they were once thrown into prison. They know in Russia, and like 250 years ago, they used to redeem a lot of Jews from prison. And whatever happened, they got thrown into prison one day. So they come into prison and they want to daven. The problem is in the middle of this big cell where all of these hoodlums are, which now they're sitting with, there's a big bucket, and it's the waste. So one of them starts crying. These are very holy men. So one of them like, he's really upset. We can't daven. I never missed praying to God. So the other brother tells him, what are you talking about? The same God who told you to pray 3 times a day tells you not to pray when there's waste. So normally you pray to God by praying. Today you can pray to God by not praying. So you can listen to God by not praying. So his brother got so excited by the concept that he started singing and dancing. So you imagine all of these, low lives are in this cell, Gentiles, right? Then you have these 2, these 2 holy guys, right? And they start dancing around the bucket in celebration. So what happens? The guard says, what's this craziness is going on? What's going on over here? So he comes into the cell. He says, what's going on? These 2 crazy guys, they're excited about the bucket. They started dancing around it. So they're excited about the bucket. He took the bucket out. Okay. So anyway, so the Rebbe Yehuda of Zev I don't think he can, but he decided to send a telegram. He corresponded a lot with the Lubavitch Rebbe, even though he was not a Chabad Chassid, a formal follower of the Rebbe, but a great admirer for sure. And he sent this to the Rebbe, and he said that he ruled. He thinks that you're not allowed to. So the Rebbe actually wrote back to him, and he said 3 reasons why you should be allowed to. Okay, he said, could he pray and study in the presence of a bodily waste? So the Rebbe said, well, we're going to get to that in a second. So the Rebbe says, number 1, from a halachic point of view, answering the question, not the questioner yet. First, he answers the question. First of all, the Rebbe makes a fascinating argument, which I didn't think of, that a catheter is expelling the urine and at an earlier stage than the body normally expels it. And if that's the case, it's possible, the Rebbe is saying it's possible, that the urine doesn't have the status of urine that would be of concern yet, because it didn't go through that level of processing to be complete waste. The idea is just novel thinking. It's just novel thinking. Anything to be able to argue, to permit. Okay, that's point number 1, the Rebbe says. He doesn't say that as the argument. He's just saying that possibly, right? Number 2, the prohibition to say holy words when there's waste is a rabbinic prohibition. The rabbis prohibited that. But God, the Torah, is biblical commandment from God directly to put on tefillin and to pray even. So therefore, there are the biblical commandment should override the rabbinic prohibition. But then lastly, and this is the most compelling, the Rebbe then adds text number 3. Let's read text number 3.
Preventing this patient from praying or studying Torah will certainly lead to emotional distress and consequently may also weaken the patient's physical health. Several practices have been permitted when this concern is relevant.
Okay, so what does the Rebbe say? Let's see the patient. Preventing the patient from praying or studying would lead to emotional and physical distress. You know what's going to do to this man? This man prays 3 times a day, every single day. You're going to tell him that he can't pray it could be for days or weeks, right? It's going to weigh on him. Without a question, it would weigh on him. It would be very disturbing. So ultimately the Rebbe said that even though the Rebbe generally did not rule in halachic matters, I guess he shared this information with Rabbi Yehuda Zev Segel, who then ruled that you're allowed to, which then influenced Rabbi Weiss to rule that you're allowed to even in a contagious situation. Now, what is the Rebbe referring to when he says when this see Shulchan Aruch Hoshem Mishpat 254? What is the Rebbe referring to over there? So very interestingly, so having like a case within a case within a case, sort of. The story over there is a man's on his deathbed. And it is Shabbos. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to, the rabbis prohibited anyone from acquiring something through what we call a kinyan, which is an act of acquisition. One of the ways you acquire something we had this earlier in the course, you acquire something as if you pick it up, by way of example. Okay? So you're not allowed to, because that's business, transactional, and that could lead to exchange of money and other things that are prohibited on Shabbos. Therefore, they forbade any form of transactions on Shabbos. This man's on his deathbed. He wants to settle his affairs. He wants to finalize his will and transfer ownership of things that he has, right, to others. And it's Shabbos. So what is the ruling? So transferring ownership through lifting an item is a kinyan, is a form of acquisition. It's prohibited on Shabbos, but the Code of Jewish law says it's allowed for a dying person settling their affairs. Why would it be allowed for a dying person settling their affairs? If you have a person who's dying, whatever dying means, let's say within a week of death, right? And you don't, and you put them in a very stressful situation, you're going to cause them to die prematurely. So because of that, the Code of Jewish law says that the rabbis, when they made their decree of acquisition, it wasn't in such a situation where it's going to take the life of a person. It was under normal circumstances, and therefore you're allowed to. The rabbinic prohibition is permitted. So the Rebbe said in the very same way, right? We don't know the detriment that will be caused to a patient who cannot do a very basic and meaningful ritual observance, and therefore the rabbis didn't, when they made the decree, it wasn't in a case where it would be such a great risk. Now, it did not occur to Rabbi Segel, and it did not occur to Rabbi Weiss, right, to apply to a patient putting on tefillin the same ruling as the Code of Jewish law here, and it's really very similar. Which is, I'm not saying there's a criticism of them. It's just, sometimes we get the thought, sometimes we don't. But this is part of actually what rabbis do, is trying to infer from one place to another. This is why it's very good for rabbis to confer with a fellow rabbi before they make a decision, which most rabbis actually do. They review their responsa with other rabbis before they actually make a ruling. But the most beautiful thing is that Rabbi Weiss demonstrated the real trait of a halachic authority, and that is that he was committed to the truth. He was not committed to his stature. And therefore, he reversed his decision, which is very inspiring, I would say. May the film be brought into a facility where everything is incinerated. What's the answer now? The ruling is yes, for the sake of the patient's mental and physical well-being. And this is seeing the questioner, not just the question. We're good, everyone? There is a fascinating story from the Holocaust. Actually, there was a rabbi we mentioned earlier, and I think it was in the first lesson. I think it was him, Rabbi Ephraim Ushri. He was a rabbi in the concentration camps, and he wrote an entire book of response of all the questions that he had in the concentration camp. And those questions, boy, those were messy questions, because those are not common questions at all. May they never be relevant to anything. But there was a teenager who was hospitalized in the Kovna ghetto, and he asked for a pair of tefillin to be sent. And there were rumors that the Germans would burn all of the personal belongings of the patients, of anyone that was discharged. It would get burned. So the question was, can you give him a pair of tefillin or not? Right? Rabbi Ushri, for whatever reason, we don't have the whatever. Rabbi Ushri ruled that you can. Probably because we don't know for sure. It was only that was the reason why. It was rumors. It wasn't fact. So based on the rumor, we're not going to hold back the tefillin. You know, when we have there's a protocol in a hospital that anything that's in the ward that's for infectious disease is going to be burned. That's not a rumor, right? But here it was a rumor. So he said he can have it. What ended up happening was there was a Dr. Davidovich, who said he was there when the boy got the tefillin, and when the boy put them on for the first time, he said his joy was so exuberant. He was so excited. It was as if he emerged from the deepest darkness to the greatest light. It made a major difference for him emotionally. This is a good example. But what ended up happening to that hospital is the Nazis came and burned down the whole hospital with all of the patients in it. You want to hear something amazing? One person survived that fire. And that person, this boy, begged that person to please take my tefillin with you. I don't think he knew that guy would survive. He just said, take my tefillin. I guess he was much healthier than him. That guy survived, and the tefillin survived. I'm going to tell you what I think about that story. Okay? And that is this. I'm going to tell you something wild. Okay? You ready for something wild? Now you may start questioning my sanity. Okay? We know, I don't like to use the word believe, so I'm going to say we know. Okay? We know that God is the creator of the world, and God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, and that's the way we're meant to operate in the world. And from there we know that when Jewish law determines something, right, determines something to be the ruling, then the reality of the world responds to that ruling. Okay? That means like the scientific reality of the world will react to that ruling. And that's what I hear in this story. That the rabbi ruled that you could put the tefillin into, he could have the tefillin, and because he ruled that he could have the tefillin, nothing happened to the tefillin. It's a perspective. You don't have to agree with it, but I want to share it with you. Okay? Okay. Let's go to the next point here, and that is another interesting period in the Jewish history. We're going to go back to the 12th century Yemen. 12th century Yemen. So in the year 1170 or the 1170s, the Rambam. You heard of the Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, right? Who on his grave it says, "From Moses to Moses, there never arose one like Moses." That's pretty impressive. It's over maybe 2,000 years or something, right? Or probably a little bit more than that, right? So Rambam was a great man, and he received a letter from a leading rabbi in Yemen by the name of Rabbi Yaakov ben Nisanel. Rabbi Yaakov ben Nisanel was one of the leading rabbis in Yemen, and we have the Rambam's letter back to him. Okay, what is the Rambam writing to him? Let's read text 4a.
You mentioned that the ruler of Yemen decreed a forced conversion on the Jews and compelled all the inhabitants of his domain to renounce their faith, as the Almohads did in Morocco and Spain. This news has shaken us to our core and left all our communities alarmed. You also mentioned the confusion the decree caused among some people, leading them to falter in their faith and lose their belief, while others' faith remained intact.
Okay, so the Almohads were a fanatical Muslim group who forced conversion or murder, and part of just another stage in our crazy history, in our brutal history. And this rabbi is writing to the Rambam, but he's writing about something else as well that he brings up later in the letter, which the Rambam continues to respond to, and that is that at this time, you see, when Jews are in crisis, when anyone is in crisis, by the way, right? any straw of hope, most people will grab onto. And that's why, you have these people with all the calls now. They call up an older person. They tell them, if you give me $25,000, I'll give you back 60,000. And then there goes the $25,000, right? And so when people are in a vulnerable position, they're looking for hope. And that was true for the Jews as well. And what is the hope that one can bring to people who are being persecuted on this level? Guess what? A Messiah. And we've had numerous false messiahs in our history. And one of them was during this man's life. So a man rose up in the community, gets up in the community, starts saying he's Messiah. By the way, it's a syndrome. They call it the Jerusalem syndrome. I don't know if you know that. They're in Jerusalem. Yes, it is true. In Jerusalem, for whatever reason, it's not very uncommon. I was going to say it's super common, but it's more common in Jerusalem than any other place in the world, that there are individuals, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 at any given time, that run around the streets. I mean, you could tell they're a little bit off, right? That say that they're the Messiah. Usually they're not wearing shoes. They're, they dress in their vision of what Messiah is going to look like. They have long hair, and you can't have a very coherent conversation with them. So it's a little bit of a syndrome that certain people have, but you get attention because enough people. I don't think nowadays it works very well. But then this guy was getting a lot of attention. He's not the first, and he wasn't the last, because he was offering hope to people, and so the people started to believe. And when you're a believer, right? You're a believer, and I'll just say that and you don't have good guidance. It's very easy to fall into that belief, especially if you're being persecuted. And so this Rabbi Yaakov Nasano mentions this to the Rambam. This is a man. He says he's the Messiah. He's going to restore peace. He's going to bring us all to Israel. And so the Rambam writes a famous letter, which is called the Igeret Teman, the letter to the Yemenite Jews, which is this letter, countering this messianic claim of this guy. Now, and the Rambam says very simply, the guy's a nut job. Right, and he tells him how it's so clear. It's like so clear. So let's read text 4b.
You wrote about the man who boasted of being Mashiach in Yemen. I am neither surprised by him nor by those who follow him. I am not surprised about him, for he is undoubtedly deranged, and there is no shame in an illness that's not self-inflicted. As for those who follow him, their behavior is due to their suffering and their ignorance about the lofty stature of Mashiach. What surprised me was your doubts about this matter, given that you are a learned person who has seen the words of the sages. I'm surprised that you wrote that this claimant, quote, is known for his piety and possesses a bit of wisdom, end quote. Do these qualities make someone God's Mashiach? Mashiach will be in the stature highest among those prophets and the most distinguished after Moses. A prophet must be supremely wise to be granted prophecy by God, as our sages taught. Quote, prophecy only rests upon one who is wise, strong, and wealthy. They clarified that strong refers to conquering inner temptation, and wealthy refers to being rich in knowledge. Accordingly, we would not believe an ignorant person who claims to be a prophet. How much more so when he claims to be Mashiach? We know of this man's ignorance because you related how he commanded people to give all their wealth to charity, and they did not obey him. They acted correctly while he sinned. The Talmud teaches that one who gives generously should not give away more than a fifth of their assets.
Very good. So the Rambam is very clear. This guy is unwell, and he used a basic evidence to him. It's interesting because, like all cult leaders, it seems they all have the same thing: give me all your money, which is I'm thinking maybe to start something because, but right. So he says that this is clearly not aligned with the Torah, and so we know that a prophet is exceptional wisdom and a Torah scholar. This guy doesn't have any exceptional wisdom, and he's not a Torah scholar. So clearly, he's not Mashiach. So much so that he's surprised that this Rabbi Yaakov ben Asanel, who is a Torah scholar, couldn't figure this out on his own. Like, you don't know that? Like, you need me to tell you that? Right? He's very surprised by that. So, and it's a good question to ask. Why, in fact, did Rabbi Yaakov ben Nesanel fall for this false Messiah? Now, here's a possibility. Okay, we're going to make a suggestion here. I'm not 100% convinced by this suggestion, to be honest with you, but it's a possibility for sure. And that is that Rabbi Yaakov ben Nesanel had the fifth factor. His whole writing to the Rambam and having the Rambam say that this man is a false Messiah was all so that he who is embedded in the community and a part of the community is not the one who's saying it. You know, a brilliant advice that the Rebbe wrote to many people many times, wrote to many parents many times, is that you should find someone who has influence on your child other than yourself to speak to him about the issue, but you should not speak to him. It's very, very good. It is very insightful that a lot of parents overlook. A lot of parents don't stop harassing their kids. You didn't get the memo yet. Your kid doesn't listen to you, right? It's nothing personal. It's just that your relationship is too close. That's all. It's nothing personal. It's just that certain relationships don't permit for certain influences. So you have to turn to another relationship for it. That's all. That's the way it works, right? So he understood this. So he says, so what does he do? The people may have been less inclined to accept his answer. He has an agenda. He's feeling threatened that this Messiah is going to take him over. Who knows what, right? People come up with all different types of ideas, right? So, so what does he do? He sends this to the Rambam. So perhaps he was using his intuition. And the Rambam was also using his own intuition over here, because the Rambam goes further. He not only responds and says this guy's a nut job, he then recommends what should be done to him. And here you can see the power. When I say the power, I mean the strength, the inner strength of the Rambam. Because I'll say, just from my very limited experience, the Rambam was a world leader, but from my very limited experience, sometimes it's hard to do something to take a real stand, because there are always going to be some people who are going to question what you're doing. And the only way you can take a real stand is if you're really sure. So, and to be really sure, you need to be a man who has clarity and, I can look back at certain things where I wish I had more clarity at the time. But then again, we live and we learn. So I definitely learned a lot as well. But let's read what Rambam says to do with this guy. What should we do with this guy? Text 4c.
I will offer you sound advice for the benefit of both the messianic pretender and for your entire community. Imprison this man for a time until it becomes widely known among the non-Jews that he is mentally unstable. Make this public knowledge and then release him. By doing this, you will save him. When the non-Jews hear of his claims, they will mock him and consider him a madman, as he truly is, but they will leave him alone. This maneuver will also protect your community from persecution. However, if you allow him to remain free until his actions become known to the non-Jews, they will likely execute him. He may also become a cause for persecution against the entire community.
Excellent. The Rambam actually mentions in the letter, which we're not reading now, 4 other cases of people who claimed to be a Mashiach, a Messiah, in earlier times, which led to Jewish persecution. In case you thought this was like, this guy had some brilliant idea, he was probably copying some other people, right? So he shares 4 other. Why would a false Messiah lead to persecution of the Jewish people? The reason why is, number one, is a messianic figure. If he's really dynamic, usually these guys had charisma, but they were off, right? So if they can really get a movement growing, they create civil unrest, right? No leader wants civil unrest. So that leads immediately to the Jewish people being persecuted. Another reason why is a Jewish Messiah. What does that mean? That's an attack on the other religions, right? Which again was going to lead to persecution. So the Rambam has this insight and understanding, and he advised him, you got to lock this guy up, so we are the ones who are pointing out that he's crazy. right? Before this becomes a major problem. And that's often what happens is, and this is what, a professional politician does this very, very well, right? Hopefully he'll be out of office before the results kick in, right? He kicks the can down the road because he doesn't have any backbone, right? And things explode. You blame it on the predecessor, on the next guy, and somebody, but it wasn't you for sure, right? So you have to be a real leader like Maimonides, and you have to also have this fifth factor in order to handle a situation like this. Let's go to another scenario. Another scenario is using the fifth factor to actually shape a halachic decision. You see, Maimonides was not dealing with a halachic decision. He was dealing with a social situation, right? Which we also have to be smart about. But now we're going to see how the fifth factor can impact a Jewish law decision about what Jewish law says we should do. We sort of had that with the tefillin. We're going to have it here as well. In the year 1615, Rabbi Meir of Lublin receives a letter from Reb Shmuel, who was the Av Bezdin, the head of the Jewish court of Pasha Mashal. You ever hear of Pasha Mashal? You never heard of Pasha Mashal? I had to go onto the internet just to know how to pronounce this. Here you go. That's Google says this is how you pronounce this Pasha Mashal. But I somehow have that vaguely in the back of my head as well. What's the story over here? The story is, I'm giving away the story here. The story is, let's read text number 5. A crazy story for a Jewish community, I have to say. This is very, very unusual in the Jewish community. Text 5a. Yeah, go for it, Alan.
I received the verdict you issued regarding the hideous and aberrant act, the murder committed by one of the ruffians among our people, as noted in the affidavits that you sent to me. The murderer is in the custody of the Polish police, and his fate has yet to be decided. You requested my opinion on this and whether you are judging correctly in absolving him of the death penalty. Although I am not yet settled and do not have my sacred books with me, as they are still in Lublin, I will respond briefly.
Okay, so it seems like he was somehow in transit or something. He didn't have his books, which no rabbi really appreciates, because you always want to be able to reference a little bit. But he was a great rabbi, Meir of Lublin, and he answers this question. And what's the story that these Jewish ruffian murdered 2 Jews on Shabbos in public, which is really, really very, very uncommon in a Jewish community. Thank God we're not murderers. We're not murderers. So, and he stood to be executed by the Poles. So the Polish court, the police grabbed him, and they would do what they do to anyone who murders, right? It was a case closed. And the families of the victims, what do you think they said? Kill him. The guy's a danger, right? So, but here's the fascinating thing. The Jewish community could spare him from death. How could they spare him from death? Because the way things were set up in Poland at that time was that the Jews were given their own self-governance. So the Jews can say, hand him to us, and we're going to govern him because it was in our domain. So we're going to deal with it. And they would have done that. The thing is, there was hardly a precedent of such a case amongst the Jewish community, because thank God, we don't have murderers, right? So what should the Jewish community do? That is the question. If you go to text 206, exercise 5.1, what arguments justify allowing the Polish authorities to impose capital punishment in this case? Do you have an argument to say, let the Poles kill him? What would your argument be to say, let the Poles kill him? Anyone? It's biblical law. Okay, fine. Not really. Well, one can argue. I'm just going to argue for devil's advocate that not really, because in biblical law you need to have 2 witnesses to warn him before he committed the murder, and then for him to commit the murder in front of the 2 witnesses, all within a few seconds. And we'll just assume that didn't happen. There were probably witnesses, but no one warned them. Okay. Any other argument? I'm using that to go to another argument. If you let him go, he may kill again. Okay, that's a strong argument. Okay. What reasons might the Jewish community have for invoking their autonomy to spare their murderer from the death penalty and pursue an alternative form of punishment? One of the ideas was to chop off a limb. Take him, we're going to chop off a limb. Okay. Or any other form. Any argument to do that, or everyone agrees that we should just leave him with the Poles and let the Poles kill him? So the concern maybe the Poles killing Jews. Okay. This may be the first time they're justified. And the last time. Okay, so let's see what Rav Shmuel, when he sent this letter to Rav Meir of Lublin, he stated a case. He made a case, and his case was that they should take him back and not let the Poles kill him. That's what he argued. Look over here. Rav Shmuel writes, the death penalty can only be carried out by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. He argued that death penalty, like today, there is no Jewish court that will ever implement death penalty. None. Not here. We for sure can't, because we're not the law of the land, but not in Israel either. I mean, the Torah is also not the law of the land in Israel. But even so, there is no court that would implement capital punishment today. So he says the reason why is because you need the Sanhedrin, which was the high court we had when we had a temple, and they used to sit in the temple, the 71 sages, whatever it was, 70 sages, and they would sit, and you need that for capital punishment. Number two, murder was not a widespread societal issue. If you're going to argue that we need to, from a rabbinic, the rabbis are empowered to implement any form of punishment that they need to if they feel that something is getting out of hand in society. But murder wasn't getting out of hand. It was an isolated case. So he says that's not a reason to kill him either. If we cannot execute him, we must spare him from others too. So if we, his argument is this is a little misunderstanding. If we, the Jews, can't perform capital punishment, how are we going to let the Poles do capital punishment? It doesn't make sense. So we should take him back. We'll figure out what to do with him so that he doesn't kill again. Maybe chop off his hands. Right? Whatever. I'm not, it's gory and everything. I'm just saying whatever. Right? Okay, that was his argument. Comes Rabbi Meir of Lublin, and he says, I completely disagree with you. Completely disagree on all grounds. First of all, any qualified Beis Din can impose capital punishment. He just disagrees on the technical point of view, and this requires deeper analysis to understand their arguments, which we're not going to go into now. But he says any Jewish court actually can implement capital punishment. He says that a Jewish court. You see, I said earlier that murder was not a widespread societal issue. If it was a widespread societal issue, a Jewish court would be allowed to take the law into their own hands for the safety of society, and they would be allowed to commit capital punishment on this person. But this wasn't a widespread issue. So comes Rav Meir and says, you're allowed to also kill someone who, according to the Torah, does not deserve capital punishment. A court can choose still to perform capital punishment if we're concerned that this will lead to, it's not a problem on the ground today, but it will lead to a problem in the future. And one can argue that it will. You see a guy in broad daylight murders two people, and you're not killing him. Right? It can take another wild guy who was thinking about it. Now he'll start doing it, and then it becomes a problem. And lastly, he says, certainly we don't need to intervene to save him. Certainly, we are not obligated to go to the Polish government and say, give him to us, right? And don't commit capital punishment. The guy's a murderer. He got caught by the Gentiles. He is a danger. We don't have to intervene. These are his arguments. But we still didn't get to his fifth factor argument. He comes to the strongest argument. And the strongest argument is, Rav Meir says, this doesn't look good to outsiders. The Poles will kill someone who committed murder in broad daylight, and the Jews won't. What are people going to say? The Poles will be lax in punishing anti-Jewish crimes. They say, the Jews don't care about life. We're going to care about their lives. They don't care about their own lives. So if things happen to the Jews that someone did, we're not going to defend them. We're not going to protect them. Right? On the contrary, that can lead to the Poles doing all types of harsh things to the Jewish people. So it would be, he said it would be a chilul Hashem, we call it, a desecration of God's name. It's going to show the Poles we don't take murder seriously, that we don't cherish life, and it can lead to serious damage to the Jewish community. especially in the anti-Semitic climate that they lived in those days. And so therefore he completely disagreed. And based on this fifth factor, he said for social reasons, that was the fifth factor, for understanding the dynamics of the time and place where they were living, you cannot do this. Here we're going to have another, I'm going to share another with a video. I just need to.
In 17th century Moravia, a Jewish traveler was murdered on the road. The identity of the non-Jewish assailant was no mystery, but in those days, justice did not stir unless it was demanded. A relative of the victim had to initiate a private suit, which entailed paying prosecutors, judges, and various civic officials. In this instance, the victim's relatives hesitated. Perhaps the task was too daunting. Perhaps the financial burden was too great. Whatever the reason, they failed to act, and the murderer remained free. The leaders of the Jewish community grew anxious. They turned to Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krochmal of Nikolsburg in the southeast region of the modern-day Czech Republic. Could the communal leadership, they asked, exercise its authority to compel the victim's relatives to sue the killer in the Moravian courts? And if the relatives possessed sufficient means, could they be obligated to bear the legal costs involved? Rabbi Krochmal drew on the Talmud to respond affirmatively, but he also drew a line. Given the endemic corruption, bribes or purchased letters of recommendation were often required to advance a case through the bureaucratic mire. These costs, the rabbi clarified, could not be imposed upon the family. Otherwise, relatives of victims fearing financial ruin would escape to other towns, and murderers would go unpunished. Rabbi Krochmal invoked a Talmudic precedent. The sages recount how, in ancient Israel, funeral rites had become so extravagant that some families, unable to meet the costs, abandoned their dead. Rabban Gamliel reversed this trend by requesting to be buried in simple linen. Once this became the norm, no one abandoned their dead anymore. So too here, Rabbi Krochmal reasoned, render the pursuit of justice prohibitively expensive, and justice itself will disappear. In cases when bribes were needed to bring the killer to justice, Rabbi Krochmal stated that the Jewish community must assume responsibility for the expenses. Why? Because failure to do so would place all members of the community in peril. If no charges were brought, if Jewish blood could be shed without consequence, every merchant, every student, and every family who ventures onto the road will do so in danger. He reminded the community that it had long been the accepted practice for Jewish leadership to seek justice, even when the prospects of conviction were dim. These cases were brought before the Moravian courts to declare publicly and unequivocally that Jewish blood is not ownerless. Rabbi Krochmal was not merely a jurist who interpreted sacred texts. He was a leader who understood how incentives shape action and how perception determines public safety. In a world where justice was fragile, Rabbi Krochmal found a way to protect his community through deep human understanding.
All right, that's another scenario that we have. 1 second. Okay, there we go. Okay. Well, now we are going to go back to motives. Motives are always a lot of fun and unfortunate. But, the motives that people have in doing what they do and being aware of them, which is part of a rabbi's job, is to be aware of the motives. We're going back to our story with the Cyprianic chickens. Remember them? Okay. So often there is more to the story that needs to be uncovered, and a wise rabbi using his fifth factor can determine that. Let's go back to these new breeds of chickens. So we learned that the Torah lists 24 birds which are not kosher. What language is the Torah written in? Hebrew. right? Or really Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, we'll call it, but ancient Hebrew, so biblical Hebrew, right? And a lot of those, especially when it comes to the names of animals and different things, we don't necessarily always know exactly what it's referring to, right? So we have a problem. So how do we know which birds are in fact kosher? Maybe it's one of the 24 birds that are not kosher. So we discussed that we have two things. There's a Masorah, a tradition. So anything that has a tradition from community to community, generation to generation as a kosher bird, we can eat it. But if there's a bird that loses its tradition, we have a problem. The Talmud actually put together common denominator signs that all kosher or non-kosher birds have. However, it's not a black and white and conclusive. A bird, it's quite confusing actually. That most birds do, but there is an exception where one has this and this, but doesn't have that, whatever it is. So it's not a very solid, ironclad system of guidelines to follow. So that leaves us really with the very best way to determine which birds are kosher is Masorah's tradition. Okay, so just a second here. Where am I? One second, I just lost my place over here. Okay. Okay. So in 1871, a few years after the Cyprus chicken incident came up, a new breed of chicken was found in Dubrovna. And the rabbi there, whose name was Rabbi Tamarkin, ruled that the chicken was a kosher chicken. It's not a problem. It's like all the other chickens. It's slightly different, but it's all part of it's a kosher chicken. And he sent his responsa, his answer to whoever asked him whether it's kosher, to the fourth LUBAVITCH Rebbe, the Rebbe Maharash. He felt that he just needs a higher up approval on what he's writing. So he sends it to the Rebbe Maharash. The Rebbe Maharash agreed, and he added an additional point. So you have a new bird, a bird comes to Russia. The Rebbe Maharash agrees that it's a kosher bird by all means, and he has an additional point. Let's see how he responds. Let's read text number 6.
For all these reasons, it seems to me that these chicken are permitted to be eaten. The humble shall eat and be satisfied. In our town of Lubavitch, they are eaten without the slightest hesitation. I have also heard that this matter has already been thoroughly investigated and they were ruled kosher. Similarly, in places nearby, such as Vitebsk and the surrounding areas, the accepted practice is to treat them as kosher. The stringencies have originated with the slaughterers and the tax lessees of your community, as chickens bring them less revenue.
Oh, the Rebbe Maharash just says, in fact, he's just clear. He says, do you want to know why people are questioning whether they're kosher? They're trying to get more birds out of the market. Why are they trying to get more birds out of the market? Because they have financial benefit. Who are these people who are having financial benefit? There are two people. One is the shochet, the one who slaughters, and the other are the tax collectors. Okay, and I'll explain both of them. So, but this is the fifth factor. Slaughterers were paid little to nothing for chickens. Generally, so there were two. And by the way, again, I think I made reference to him in a previous class. There is this book. It's actually called The Sheichet, and that there happens to be a Chabad a Hasidic Jew who lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and his book, which was translated from Yiddish recently into English, is very fascinating. And he writes about being a shochet and what was going on in those days in the towns and everything. But one of the things, there were two types of arrangements that towns made with a shochet. Everyone needed a shochet. Oh, you have to eat chickens, right? So who's going to slaughter the chickens? So what they did was often they would hire a shochet. They would give him a salary. And this salary included the slaughtering of any chickens brought to you, you have to slaughter. So they didn't get any extra payment. But if you came to them with a goose, with a duck, with a lamb, or with a cow, then you would have to pay them a few more kopecks or something, right? So what do they didn't want to spend time shechting chickens, right? So the more chickens they can say, oh, it's questionable, we don't know if it's kosher, right? So now Now, we're not necessarily saying that they were consciously, saying birds are not kosher when there was no reason to say that. But what happens is, whenever there is a slight agenda, especially when it's money, our minds begin to bend in that direction. So we say, well, it is interesting because it is in fact a little bit different. So I'm not quite sure if this is the chicken that we have a tradition for. Right? I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, that type of a thing. But and that because our biases actually bend the way we see things. So that could have been what was going on. And that's what the Rebbe Marash was saying. He's not saying it was conscious or unconscious, but the Rebbe Marash was clear that these chickens are kosher, and all the people are saying that there's a question about them are being biased by money. Then now some towns actually did not have this arrangement where they hired the shochet. Where the shochet was hired, he was given a salary. He had no benefit from shechting chickens, other than his base salary. I mean, every extra chicken was just work for him, right? But then there were towns where he didn't get a salary. They paid per animal, but chickens there was hardly any income because it was a dime a dozen. So that wasn't where their income was from. So they weren't interested. Then there were the tax laws. The tax laws were the Tsarist Russia imposed consumption tax on the Jews. Right? They even got a tax what Jews eat. Right? It's a consumption tax. So they were charged for every animal that was eaten. And what they did, the government did was they even gave. There was a period where the communal board was in charge of getting the money that they had to give to the Tsar. But then the Tsar empowered individuals. They were the tax collectors from the town. And what they would often do is they would charge people much more. And then they'd be making, and that would be their income. And they'd make a killing. So, and they charged, and we know the numbers. They charged much more for any other bird other than the chicken. So they had an agenda to say, and these were, we'll say, quote unquote, I'm going to say, religious people. So they disparaged some of these chickens, our poor chickens, right? Where was PETA when we needed them, right? and they disparaged and said they're not kosher chickens, to get some more chickens out of the market so they can make more money on the taxes. And so Rebbe Marash saw this very clearly, and he called this out as exactly what it is. It was called korupka. Who speaks? We have any? No, korupka? A box. Yes, they call it a box. They call it a box because it was in the box that they would put the taxes. Yeah. So the Rebbe Marash says slaughterers were paid little to nothing for chickens, and tax collectors received more for larger animals. So that's what was driving the entire market. This again, two things. You need to have a rabbi who's going to say that the slaughterers have an agenda. What do you think is going to happen the next day? The slaughterers, what they're going to say about this rabbi, forget about it, right? You need to have a backbone. You need to be a man that stands on principle, that has a backbone, and understands what drives people. And to say it. And I'm sure that there were times where rabbis paid dearly for it. But anyway, I think also a rabbi that has a real good fifth factor has a better chance of not collapsing from it, because the people know his integrity. At least I like to think that anyway. Okay. Now we're going to go to another scenario. And this is a really interesting story. We'll see what you have to say about it. So here, the outcome of this is people might frame personal interests as ethics. The discerning rabbi upholds the integrity of the halachic process. Okay. So here we're going to find an interesting Barcelona, 1300s. We have a very interesting scenario about a Jew who owned a beautiful home next to the synagogue, connected the two buildings. Well, what's going on over here? Let's read text number 7.
You asked, Reuven owned a home near the synagogue, which he had built beautifully, and he wanted to connect it to the synagogue to enlarge the sanctuary. However, the community didn't allow this because it would have degraded the value of the existing seats. Instead, they agreed that the extension would house the Torah Ark. And that's what they did, with Reuven sponsoring the entire project. The donor Reuben has now come to inscribe his name over the ark so that he will be remembered for his donation. A few members of the congregation objected. Tell me, do they have the right to stop him or not?
Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you is if you ever sat on the board of a synagogue, and this is the reason why Chabad synagogues don't have boards typically, right? If you ever sat on the board of a synagogue, you don't have to feel so bad anymore. You see, it's going back to, we have a tradition from the 1300s, so there's always a few guys who got a problem with everything, right? Okay, but that being said, right? So this guy has a big, beautiful home next to the synagogue. He wants to attach it, right, and expand the synagogue. But he said if you expand the synagogue, they're going to add more seats. Then my front row seat is not going to be a middle row seat. And I lose all my value. So they agree that they're not going to add seats. They're only attaching this house, which will house the arks. They're going to have a big, magnificent ark, I guess, in this new part, in this connection. Fine. Now he says, I just want my name on it. And these guys are protesting that. So exercise fine. And I know that there are a lot of different sentiments to this whole idea of names on buildings. We're definitely much more used to it probably than they were then, because what significant building in America, a hospital, a university, doesn't have a name on it, right? But the question is that a good thing or not? So exercise 5.2 on to page 213. And this is the question: does the congregation have a right to stop him? We'll get to that in a second. So the arguments in favor of public recognition. Do you think that the guy should be able to put his name on the ark? What do you think? Give me an argument for or against. That's not a good argument. What's that? We do it downstairs? Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, you have a few plaques in the back over there. We have a naming on the outside of the building. Yeah. So you're saying that Chabad is the standard. So if we do it, it must be the right thing. I like that. Joe, we're going to give you a discounted membership. So you're saying a distinction of the ark. Okay. No one's going to pray to him. Well, these board members are not going to pray to him, that's for sure. Yeah. Okay, interesting. Like Joel says in the Chabad standard, you have a name on the paroches, on the curtain. Okay, yeah. Okay, I hear you. That's an argument. Any other arguments? Oh, we got the lawyer in the house. But they doesn't say that they had a contract. He's now coming and saying, I want my name on it. Let's assume they didn't have a contract. Let's assume he comes out and says, hey, I also want my name on it, like late in the deal. Okay. Well, he donated the house to the synagogue. So now it's the synagogue's, but he donated, a $500,000 extension, and he wants his name on it. Alex says, why not? He's a generous guy. Why not? Give the guy some recognition. Is it not philanthropic, or is it philanthropic and he gets some satisfaction out of it too? It takes away the philanthropy. The synagogue is not much bigger, right? Like someone put their name on our building. It's not philanthropy because he has his name. We have look what we're doing here. It's amazing things we're doing in here, right? Okay, so this question was sent to the Rashba, who we had in the first class also. And what did the Rashba say? He says, number one, there's no source that prohibits putting a donation plaque on something. We don't have any source for that. So to say that you can't do it, I don't have a basis for that. Number two, dedications are common in Spanish synagogues. Sephardic synagogues. It was common, I guess, in those days. So I guess it's not a modern invention. So he says it was a common thing. This is not an unusual thing. And lastly, he says the Talmud tells of an inscription in the Holy Temple. The Talmud actually discusses a certain inscription. It wasn't quite in any of the main parts of the temple, but there was something there that was inscribed. but that's a precedent to say that inscriptions in temples and where we worship God is not, is not absolutely wrong. It's not absolutely wrong. So therefore, he ruled. This is without the fifth factor. This is just technical. He's answering the question now. But now to get to the fifth factor, what does he say? Then he quotes a midrash. And this is what the midrash says. Let's read text number 8. Text number 8. That's on page 214. Who's got the mic? Go ahead.
Reuben known that God would write about him, Genesis 37:21. Reuben heard and saved Joseph from their hand. He would have carried Joseph on his shoulder to his father. Had Aaron known that God would write about him, Exodus 4:14, behold, Aaron is coming out to greet you. He would have gone to greet Moses with tambourines and dancing. Had Boaz known that God would write about him, Ruth 2:14, he handed Ruth roasted grain and she ate and was satisfied and had some left over. He would have fed her fat calves.
Okay. What's this midrash saying? Reuven was the oldest brother of the 12 tribes when Joseph was being sold. Right? So the midrash says, had Reuven known that God would have written about him, the Reuven heard and saved Joseph from their hand because they were going to kill him. So Reuven said, throw him into a pit. And so God said about Reuven, he saved him. Had he known that God would have complimented him that way, he would have picked up Joseph and brought him all the way home. Right? Then Aaron, when Aaron came to, so Moses is coming now from Midian. Thank you from Midian. And he's coming down to Egypt. He's coming down to Egypt. Anything to make it look good, Joel. Thank you. So he's coming down from Midian to Egypt to take the Jews out of Egypt. And one of his big concerns to God, he negotiated for 7 days, was, I have an older brother. He's 3 years older than me, and he's a great man, Aaron. Why don't you make him the one who's going to take the Jews out? So God said, Aaron will be very happy for you. So what happened when he came? It said, the Torah says, behold, Aaron is coming out to greet you. Had Aaron known that God would say that about him, then he would have gone to greet Moses with much greater joy with tambourines and dancing. He would have had a whole band over there to celebrate Moses' coming. And then there was Boaz and Ruth. I'm not going to get into the whole story there. But basically, had he known that God would have embraced his generosity to Ruth, he would have given her, instead of some extra grain, roasted grain, he would have given her fat calves, like far more to eat. Point is, when people are acknowledged, right, they will do so much more. So therefore, putting up names, he argues, and this is the big argument, by the way, and this is true. This is true until today. I argue with people. I have a conversation with people who want to give sometimes money anonymously. And depending on the circumstance, I sometimes ask them if they would mind not giving it anonymously. Because I feel that in this situation, when people see that you gave whatever to this situation, it's going to encourage them to also give. And if you make it anonymous, it's not encouraging, right? When there's a name to it, it's encouraging. It's a peer, it's a friend. It's, they do it. It rings. I know when my peers do certain things, it makes me think maybe I should do it too, right? Just makes you think that way. So that is the fifth factor of philanthropic community. Now, interestingly, I'm just gonna add this. We have a few extra minutes anyway, so I'm just gonna add my thoughts on this. So first of all, the Rebbe once said something really insightful. The Rebbe once said that some people say, but I don't want. I want to be modest. I don't want my name. I want to be modest. The Rebbe said, you want to be modest? No problem. Give your donation, put your name wherever it's going, and then give another donation afterwards, and don't tell anyone about that donation. Then you can be modest. And that donation no one will ever know about, because they'll never think you gave after you gave the big donation. So first give the 100,000 and then give the other 100,000 quietly. And by the way, I can help you with this if you need help. But I'll tell you what I really think about this whole thing. It's interesting that it's a very interesting dynamic. And there's something that gets triggered in us, which I don't think comes from a holy place. When someone does something and gets a big acknowledgement for it. And I think that's really what bothers, if we are bothered. I think that's what bothers us when people's names go on buildings. Because the thing is, I will tell you, I know as working in this field, that there are plenty of people who have their names up who do not want their names up. They don't want their names up. But anyone who fundraises will encourage them to put their name up. And often they are so selfless that they will put their name up, even though they don't want it up. And they don't want the recognition. They don't like the publicity and the whole thing. Right? But they do it because they are truly idealistic. And they say, Rabbi, you know what? If this is going to help to raise more money so we can finish the project, then you know what? Put my name up. Right? But their initial action is, now I'm not going to say that's true for everyone, as we all know. That's not true for everyone. But then there's another idea in Yiddish. We call it tifargin. It's really what Alex did it really beautifully before when he said it, right? It's like, what does it bother you that he has his name up? So let him have his name up and let him be excited about it. And let him feel like he owns the town now because of it. Okay, so he does, right? He still did a good thing, right? It's never easy to dish out $500,000 out of anyone's pocket. I don't care how wealthy, a billionaire, it's not easy to take $500,000 out of your pocket, give your hard-earned money away. Right? So the guy did it. Okay. So let him ride high. Let him feel good about himself. He's not taking advantage of anyone. No one's getting hurt by it. It's only to the benefit of the community. It's all good. Right? So I think those are, to me, those are the factors that we should see from an emotional point of view when we see, people give money and they put their names up. Okay. In conclusion, here's the power of recognition. Reuben just they all had they known their actions would be immortalized, they would have done even better. Okay. The bottom line is that how we make choices can influence our relationship with the Gentiles around us, the Ammonites, the Poles, all different types of people. Human psychology is a very big factor in what makes things, the way things operate and what makes things flow. And for communal well-being, we have to be very much aware of human psychology. And there's much more knowledge that a rabbi needs to have than just knowing what it says in the books. And when we approach the education and influence with sensitivity towards others, we have the best chance of effective guidance. We conclude tonight's class, everyone. Next week is our final class. Looking forward to it, and hopefully you'll be able to make it out. All right, have a good night, everyone.